Part 1. Childhood in the Shadow of Execution. Imagine being born into the glittering promise of royalty, only to have that dream shattered before you even knew how to walk. That was the reality of Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Her life began in blood, politics, and betrayal. And unlike most princesses in fairy tales, Elizabeth's story didn't begin with lullabies. It began with the sound of an executioner's axe. Elizabeth entered the world in 1533, a child of scandal as much as hope. Her mother Anne Boleyn had risked everything for her crown. She supplanted Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, endured whispers of witchcraft, and faced the rage of a country divided by religion. For a short moment, Elizabeth was the dazzling prize, a princess, the legitimate heir to England. But that moment ended almost as soon as it began. When Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old, her mother was executed on charges of adultery and treason. For centuries, historians have argued about whether those charges were fabricated, but the result was the same. A queen's head fell, and with it, Elizabeth's status. Parliament declared her illegitimate. Overnight, she went from Her Grace to little more than a political inconvenience. This would be enough to break most children. Imagine being told, before you can even read, that your mother was disgraced, your father barely acknowledges you, and the country views you as a reminder of scandal. But Elizabeth's resilience began here, in the ashes of her mother's downfall. She was removed from the royal court, stripped of much of her household, and sent into a kind of polite exile in the countryside. To most courtiers, she was the red-haired daughter of a condemned queen, a living lesson in the dangers of ambition. Servants whispered, nobles ignored her, and her place in the line of succession seemed erased. Yet, in this isolation, something remarkable happened. Instead of bitterness, Elizabeth began to observe. She absorbed the silence around her, but not as a victim, more like a sponge. She learned quickly that survival in Tudor England required more than birthright. It demanded intelligence, adaptability, and above all, patience. This pattern, being underestimated, discarded, and yet quietly preparing, would define her entire life. While her half-sister Mary burned with Catholic zeal, and her half-brother Edward suffered under the pressures of sickly kingship, Elizabeth was building something different, a mind sharper than any sword in the kingdom. But in these early years, she was just a child who had lost her mother to the executioner, her legitimacy to politics, and her place in court to the whims of her father. What she gained, though, was something that no crown could guarantee, an unshakable instinct for survival. Her childhood was a crucible, burning away illusions of safety, family, and permanence. Instead, it forged in her a toughness that would later astonish her enemies. Elizabeth learned early that power was fragile, love was conditional, and security was an illusion. And yet, here's the twist that makes her story extraordinary. Rather than being destroyed by her circumstances, she began to master them. Elizabeth's childhood wasn't gilded, it was haunted. But it was in that haunted space, surrounded by whispers of scandal and betrayal, that she started to become the queen who would one day defy kings, conquer enemies, and rule alone in a world that told her she couldn't. Part 2. Learning silence, mastering knowledge. If Elizabeth's childhood taught her that power was fragile, her education taught her how to wield it. While most girls of her time were trained to embroider, manage households, and obey husbands, Elizabeth was trained like a prince, and that made all the difference. Henry VIII may have discarded her legitimacy, but he didn't completely abandon her education. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps it was strategy, or perhaps he simply enjoyed the idea that all of his children would display royal brilliance. Whatever the reason, Elizabeth received tutors who belonged to the intellectual elite of the day. These men believed that education could forge not just good Christians, but leaders. Elizabeth excelled in everything. She mastered Latin, Greek, French, and Italian with such fluency that even ambassadors marveled. Later in life, she would add Spanish to her arsenal, not out of love for Spain, but because knowledge was always her weapon. And unlike many royals, she wasn't satisfied with surface learning. She devoured philosophy, history, theology, and the classics. She read Cicero, Seneca, and Plato. She didn't just memorize, she analyzed, questioned, and debated. But perhaps her most important subject was survival. By the age of 9, she had already adopted a personal motto, Video et taceo, I see and say nothing. Imagine that for a moment. A child in elementary school today might pick a motto like, reach for the stars, or follow your dreams. Elizabeth's motto was essentially, keep quiet and watch everyone. That's not childish wisdom. That's survival strategy. In a court riddled with spies, betrayals, and ever-shifting alliances, silence was her armor. Speaking out of turn could mean execution. Having an opinion on religion could mean exile or worse. So Elizabeth learned to watch, to wait, to store knowledge like a squirrel hiding nuts for winter. She studied not just from books, but from people. Henry VIII's 6 wives provided a living textbook of political disaster. Catherine of Aragon taught her the dangers of pride and stubbornness. Anne Boleyn, her own mother, showed her how quickly love could turn to death. Jane Seymour, who died after childbirth, warned her of the risks of motherhood. Catherine Howard, executed for adultery, demonstrated how youth and recklessness could be fatal. And Catherine Parr, the last wife, taught Elizabeth that intelligence and diplomacy could protect you, at least for a time. Elizabeth saw in her father a man who ruled by appetite and temper, and in her half-siblings, examples of how ideology could blind rulers to practicality. She learned lessons from their mistakes without needing to repeat them. But this was not just about cynicism. Elizabeth truly loved learning. In one letter, she compared knowledge to a companion that never betrayed her, unlike so many humans had. Her education became her sanctuary. While others saw a disgraced child, she was quietly becoming one of the most brilliant minds in Europe. And it wasn't just intellectual brilliance. Elizabeth's teachers also drilled her in rhetoric and performance. The ability to persuade, to command, to inspire. These skills would one day transform her into one of the greatest public speakers of her age, capable of rallying soldiers or charming ambassadors. Every time she translated Cicero or debated theology, she was sharpening the very tools that would make her throne unshakable. Now, let's pause and imagine Elizabeth at 12 years old, not a carefree princess, but a girl with red hair, sharp eyes, and an air of restraint far beyond her years. She sits surrounded by books, scribbling notes in Latin, while all the while listening to the whispers of servants and the shifting moods of the court. She knows she isn't safe. She knows she has no guarantee of a future. And yet, she prepares. This is why Elizabeth fascinates me. Many rulers stumbled into power, unprepared. Elizabeth, on the other hand, lived as if the crown might come to her by accident, and if it did, she would be ready. Her education gave her more than knowledge. It gave her adaptability. She could speak to Protestant reformers in fluent Latin, impress Catholic bishops with her knowledge of Scripture, and later spar with ambassadors in their native tongues. She became a mirror, reflecting back what others wanted to see, while always hiding what she truly thought. Silence, knowledge, adaptability. These weren't just academic skills, they were weapons. And Elizabeth learned how to use them long before she had an army, a crown, or even a reason to believe she'd survive into adulthood. In these formative years, she wasn't yet the Virgin Queen, the Gloriana, or the iron-willed monarch who would face down the Spanish Armada. She was simply a girl who understood one thing. If she couldn't control her birth, her family, or her fate, then she would control herself. And in Tudor England, that was the smartest move anyone could make. Part 3. Trapped by family, saved by strategy. Elizabeth's early brilliance and careful silence didn't make her life safer. It only made her survival possible. The Tudor dynasty was less a family and more a storm that ate its own children. And Elizabeth, always caught in the middle, had to learn the art of survival the hard way, by watching those closest to her fall. Her half-sister Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, was deeply Catholic and carried resentment like a stone in her chest. She never forgot how her mother had been cast aside to make room for Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's mother. For Mary, Elizabeth wasn't just a sibling, she was a living insult. Her half-brother Edward, son of Jane Seymour, leaned Protestant, but was frail, sickly, and manipulated by advisors who treated the throne like a prize in a blood-soaked game of pass the parcel. Elizabeth, trapped between these siblings, realized something chilling. Religion wasn't just about belief, it was a weapon, and she was always standing at the edge of its blade. When Protestants gained influence, Elizabeth emphasized her Reformed faith. When Catholics reigned, she nodded solemnly and kept her Bible hidden. She wasn't hypocritical. She was pragmatic. She mastered the art of being devoutly vague. Think about how much discipline that required. While others shouted, debated, and burned at the stake for their beliefs, Elizabeth whispered nothing. She learned that the safest position in Tudor politics was not the center stage, but the shadow just behind the curtain. And yet, even in the shadows, she couldn't escape danger. After Henry VIII's death, Elizabeth was briefly welcomed into the household of Catherine Parr, the king's last wife. For a moment, she tasted something like maternal affection. Catherine treated her with kindness, encouraged her education, and allowed her to feel like more than a discarded pawn. But this peace shattered when Catherine remarried Thomas Seymour, the ambitious and reckless brother of Jane Seymour. Thomas Seymour was a man driven by hunger. Hunger for power, influence, and perhaps Elizabeth herself. Historical accounts describe his behavior toward the teenage princess as deeply inappropriate. He would wake her early, tickle her, chase her in gardens, and even cut her dresses in play. While some at the time brushed this off as mischief, even Elizabeth knew it wasn't normal. In a court where scandal could destroy lives, these encounters were dangerous. When Catherine Parr discovered the situation, the household fractured. Catherine's death shortly after childbirth left Elizabeth once again vulnerable and surrounded by whispers. This experience left a permanent scar. She had seen how easily her reputation could be weaponized against her. From then on, she would keep her relationships ambiguous, her private life untouchable, and her body politic untouchable. Her motto, "I see and say nothing," proved itself again. She escaped scandal, but with a sharpened awareness. She could trust no one, especially men who smiled too much. And then came the most dangerous chapter yet: Queen Mary's suspicion. In 1554, a Protestant rebellion, Wyatt's Rebellion, broke out against Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain. Elizabeth's name surfaced repeatedly, even though she wasn't directly involved. That was enough for Mary. Elizabeth was dragged to the Tower of London, the same fortress where her mother had died. Imagine being 20 years old, riding through Traitor's Gate in the rain, unsure if you would ever see the sun again. For Elizabeth, this wasn't just a prison, it was the edge of her own grave. Yet even here, she didn't panic. She denied the charges firmly but calmly. She wrote letters declaring her innocence, carved her name into the tower walls, and endured interrogations without breaking. Guards tried to intimidate her with damp rooms and psychological games. She refused to crack. What's extraordinary here isn't just her composure. It's her refusal to let her enemies write her ending. Many noblewomen in her position would have begged, fainted, or pleaded for mercy. Elizabeth did none of that. She projected innocence without desperation, strength without defiance. She played the game perfectly. In the end, Mary couldn't find enough evidence to execute her sister. Elizabeth was released, but not into freedom. Instead, she was placed under house arrest, watched carefully, a prisoner with slightly better furniture. Yet this was a victory. She had faced death in the tower and walked away. These years of entrapment, by stepfathers, half-siblings, and political enemies, hardened Elizabeth into something more than just a survivor. She became a strategist. She learned that in a world where loyalty was a mask and religion a weapon, the greatest shield was self-control. So when people later marveled at Elizabeth's ability to outmaneuver armies, kings, and even popes, they often forgot where it began. It began here, in her youth, when she learned how to keep her head, while everyone around her was losing theirs, sometimes literally. Elizabeth wasn't saved by luck, she was saved by strategy. Part 4. From Prisoner to Queen. By the time Elizabeth emerged from the Tower of London and her years of house arrest, she had been tested in ways most monarchs never would. She had survived suspicion, betrayal, and even the looming shadow of execution. But survival was only the beginning. When her half-sister Mary Tudor died in 1558, the crown unexpectedly landed on Elizabeth's head. And the young woman who had spent most of her life being underestimated suddenly had to prove that she could rule a fractured kingdom. England in 1558 was not the glittering empire we often imagine when we think of Elizabeth's reign. It was weak, broke, and exhausted. Years of religious conflict had ripped the country apart. Mary's alliance with Spain had dragged England into costly wars, and the loss of Calais, the last English possession in France, was a humiliating national wound. The treasury was nearly empty. Disease and famine stalked the land. To many, Elizabeth's ascension felt less like the dawn of a golden age and more like handing the throne to a gamble. She was only 25 years old, unmarried, childless, and widely distrusted. To Catholic Europe, she was an illegitimate bastard, a heretic queen. To Protestant radicals, she wasn't reformed enough. To many courtiers, she was simply a young woman who would soon be married off to some foreign prince, handing power to her husband. In short, nobody expected Elizabeth to last. And yet, from the moment she entered London, Elizabeth understood the power of performance. She rode through the streets, not as a trembling young woman, but as a monarch in command of her destiny. Contemporary accounts describe her dazzling appearance, her red hair catching the light, her gown glittering with gold and white, and her composure radiating a confidence that most didn't expect from her. Her coronation in January 1559 sealed this impression. The day itself was a logistical nightmare. Frozen roads, nervous bishops, and a nation unsure how to greet her. But Elizabeth transformed it into theater. Standing before her people, she made no promises of radical reform or revenge. Instead, she projected unity, justice, and stability. She spoke carefully, never revealing too much, yet giving enough hope for every faction to believe she might lean their way. It was a masterclass in political ambiguity. What's fascinating is how she used this vagueness as a weapon. In a time when monarchs were expected to declare bold religious stances, Elizabeth refused to box herself in. She balanced on a knife's edge, offering just enough to Protestants and just enough to Catholics to keep both sides from rebelling. Later, this would evolve into what became known as the Elizabethan religious settlement. Neither fully Protestant nor fully Catholic, but something uniquely English. But even in these early days, she revealed her defiance. Foreign ambassadors sent by Spain and France began immediately pressuring her to marry. The logic was simple. A woman alone could not rule. A queen must have a husband, and that husband would dictate the future of England. Elizabeth's answer, while polite, was firm. She would consider her options, but she would not rush. She was only 25 years old, unmarried, childless, and widely distrusted. To Catholic Europe, she was an illegitimate bastard, a heretic queen. To Protestant radicals, she wasn't reformed enough. To many courtiers, she was simply a young woman who would soon be married off to some foreign prince, handing power to her husband. In short, nobody expected Elizabeth to last. And yet, from the moment she entered London, Elizabeth understood the power of performance. She rode through the streets, not as a trembling young woman, but as a monarch in command of her destiny. Contemporary accounts describe her dazzling appearance, her red hair catching the light, her gown glittering with gold and white, and her composure radiating a confidence that most didn't expect from her. Of course, this wasn't just a romantic idea, it was hard politics. By refusing to marry, Elizabeth kept every European court guessing. Was she leaning toward Spain, France, Sweden? No one could be sure, and that uncertainty became her shield. Diplomacy was no longer about who she chose, but about who she didn't. Still, her early reign wasn't just about avoiding marriage. She immediately set to work on repairing the machinery of government. She surrounded herself with advisors who were loyal, but not blindly so. Chief among them was William Cecil, a man who understood her careful balancing act and worked tirelessly to make it succeed. Together, they restored order to the finances, curbed reckless spending, and re-established England's credibility abroad. But Elizabeth's most remarkable achievement in these first years wasn't economic or military. It was psychological. She took a nation weary of religious persecution, political chaos, and foreign entanglements, and gave it something it hadn't had in decades: stability. She didn't promise utopia. She promised survival. And in a country that had nearly torn itself apart under her father, her brother, and her sister, survival felt like a miracle. Let's pause for a moment here. Imagine being Elizabeth, standing in Westminster Abbey at her coronation. You know that half the people in that church think you're illegitimate. You know that Europe is waiting for you to fail. You know that your own council doubts you. And yet, instead of shrinking, you stand taller. You wear gold and white, not mourning black. You smile, not with naivety, but with iron beneath it. And you silently tell the world, "I am here, and I will not be moved." Elizabeth may have been crowned queen that day by ritual, but in truth, she crowned herself through sheer willpower. She entered the throne room as a gamble, but she walked out as a sovereign who intended to rule on her own terms. From prisoner to queen, Elizabeth's transformation was complete. But survival was only step one. Now, she had to prove that she could not just wear the crown, but defend it against enemies foreign and domestic. And in doing so, she would reinvent what it meant to be a monarch. Part 5. The Virgin Queen's Political Gamble. If Elizabeth's coronation was her declaration of survival, then her decision never to marry was her declaration of independence. In a world where queens were expected to become pawns in dynastic chess games, Elizabeth flipped the board. She made her singleness not a weakness, but the core of her political identity. And in doing so, she turned her private choice into one of the most brilliant power strategies in history. The pressure to marry came instantly. Courtiers, ambassadors, and even Parliament reminded her that England's security depended on her producing an heir. Suitors lined up like contestants in a reality show, each offering not only their hand but also armies, alliances, and influence. France dangled dukes with royal blood. Spain offered princes with vast empires behind them. Sweden sent noble charmers, and even her own courtiers pushed for favored Englishmen. To many, it seemed inevitable that she would choose one, but Elizabeth saw the trap. Marriage wasn't simply about love, it was about surrender. The moment she married, her power would be diluted. A husband wouldn't just be a partner, he would be seen as the true ruler, especially by foreign powers. Elizabeth had watched her sister Mary's disastrous marriage to Philip of Spain. Instead of strengthening England, it had drained the country into foreign wars and left Mary unpopular. Elizabeth refused to repeat that mistake. Instead, she began to weave the image of the Virgin Queen. This was no passive abstinence, it was a carefully cultivated myth. She declared herself married to her people, her kingdom her only spouse. To foreign ambassadors, this meant she was always considering their proposals, dangling hope but never committing. To her subjects, it meant she was untouchable, devoted solely to England. And it worked. By refusing to marry, Elizabeth became unpredictable. No court in Europe could be sure where her loyalties might land. Would she lean toward Catholic Spain? Flirt with Protestant Sweden? Consider France? Each possibility kept enemies guessing and allies hopeful. Her singleness became a diplomatic weapon sharper than any sword. At home, the choice also empowered her image. Elizabeth cultivated a persona that blended chastity with authority. Portraits showed her adorned in white gowns, pearls symbolizing purity, and jewels that glimmered like symbols of divine favor. She wasn't just a woman ruling in a man's world. She was above such categories. A virgin queen, chosen by God, untethered by the ordinary bonds of marriage and motherhood. But of course, there was another layer to this myth. Elizabeth was not cold or indifferent. She understood the art of flirtation, of intimacy balanced with distance. Robert Dudley, her childhood friend and lifelong companion, stirred endless gossip. Their closeness sparked rumors of romance, but Elizabeth never crossed the line into official union. Whether or not she truly loved Dudley, or anyone, remains debated. What matters is that she kept the line blurred. Ambiguity was her shield. This ability to control the narrative extended beyond her courtships. She weaponized delay, hesitation, and charm. When pressed on marriage by Parliament, she would deliver speeches laced with wit, humility, and a touch of scolding. She reminded them that she understood her responsibilities, but also that she would not be bullied into choices that served their interests instead of England's. One famous speech captured her strategy perfectly. "I am already bound unto a husband, which is the kingdom of England." This wasn't just a clever turn of phrase, it was a redefinition of monarchy itself. She presented her reign as a marriage contract between sovereign and people. By removing the need for a husband, she eliminated the idea that her authority could be shared. Realistically, this choice wasn't without risks. By refusing to name an heir, she left England vulnerable to succession crises. By rejecting marriage, she angered powerful factions who wanted alliances through her womb. And yet, Elizabeth calculated that the dangers of choosing wrong were far greater than the dangers of not choosing at all. Think of it this way. Elizabeth turned absence into presence. A refusal to marry wasn't a void, it was a statement. It meant she could flirt with the world, diplomatically speaking, while never being claimed. It meant she could hold the attention of Europe without giving away anything. It meant she could remain a queen first and a woman second. And here's the genius. She turned her so-called weakness into a superpower. The very thing her enemies mocked, that she was alone, childless, and vulnerable, became her most enduring strength. In an age when kings were defined by heirs and alliances, Elizabeth defined herself by something rarer: independence. This gamble set the stage for everything that followed, because once she declared herself the Virgin Queen, she wasn't just resisting marriage, she was rewriting the rules of monarchy. From now on, she wasn't competing with men on their terms. She was building a new standard altogether, and the world, whether it liked it or not, would have to play by her rules. Part 6. Court of Masks and Daggers. Elizabeth may have worn the crown, but she was never naive enough to think it made her safe. The English court under her reign was a glittering stage, dazzling in jewels and ceremony. But beneath the silks and gold chains, it was a nest of serpents. Ambition, jealousy, and betrayal were the true currency of politics. And Elizabeth ruled not just with decrees, but with theater, wit, and ruthless calculation. From the outside, her court looked like a pageant of elegance. Nobles competed for her attention with flattering poems, costly gifts, and elaborate displays of loyalty. Courtiers danced, bantered, and bowed, all under the watchful eye of a queen who knew better than to take any of it at face value. Because in truth, every compliment carried a hidden motive, every smile masked a calculation, and every gesture of loyalty was one step away from treachery. Flattery was both a tool and a trap in Elizabeth's world. Courtiers showered her with compliments, comparing her to goddesses, saints, and mythical heroines. She accepted praise with a smile, but if someone crossed the line into excessive flattery, she could turn the court's laughter against them with a sharp remark. She understood the game too well to be blinded by it. One of her greatest weapons was ambiguity. She never revealed too much of what she thought, leaving courtiers scrambling to interpret her silences and half-smiles. Was she pleased? Offended? Amused? No one could be sure. This cultivated uncertainty kept her counsel on edge, careful, and loyal out of fear of losing her favor. Yet for all the glitter, the stakes were deadly serious. Elizabeth knew that her reign was threatened not just by foreign kings, but by her own nobles. Plots and conspiracies simmered constantly. Some courtiers whispered about replacing her with Mary, Queen of Scots. Others tried to manipulate her into reckless marriages or disastrous alliances. The Queen's answer was to turn surveillance into an art. With the help of her spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham, she oversaw one of the most sophisticated intelligence networks of the 16th century. Letters were intercepted, codes broken, and traitors exposed before they could strike. The court was also Elizabeth's stage. She didn't just rule, she performed rulership. Her presence at court was a living spectacle. Her gowns, elaborate and dazzling, weren't just fashion, they were political armor. Her sharp tongue in debates wasn't just wit, it was a reminder that she could spar intellectually with any man. Even the way she entered a room was designed to remind courtiers that the center of gravity in England was not Parliament, not the Council, but the Queen herself. To survive in this court, one had to master the same skills Elizabeth had honed as a child: observation, patience, and discretion. Many courtiers failed. They mistook temporary favor for permanent security, only to find themselves abruptly sidelined or exiled. Elizabeth made sure that proximity to her throne was never a guarantee of safety. Robert Dudley, her so-called Sweet Robin, knew this well. Though deeply favored, he too was subject to her temper and her careful distance. She might raise him up with titles and lands one day, and then coolly remind him of his place the next. This unpredictability wasn't cruelty, it was control. She never allowed anyone, not even those closest to her, to forget who held the crown. Elizabeth's court was often compared to a game of chess played blindfolded on a moving ship. Pieces shifted constantly, alliances broke, rumors swirled, and yet, through it all, the Queen sat steady at the center. She didn't just rule England, she orchestrated it, turning ambition into fuel and fear into loyalty. Her genius wasn't in eliminating the vipers of her court, it was in keeping them all focused on her, competing for her approval, too distracted by ambition to unite against her. As long as the daggers remained pointed at one another, they were less likely to point at the throne. In this way, Elizabeth made her court both a mask and a battlefield. And behind the mask, behind the silk and smiles, she reigned with eyes wide open, reminding everyone that the greatest danger to them was not foreign invasion or religious conflict. It was underestimating their queen. Part 7. Pearls, Armor, and the Armada. By the late 1580s, Elizabeth had ruled for 3 decades. But her greatest test was yet to come. Spain, the richest and most powerful empire in Europe, had set its sights on England. King Philip II, fueled by religious zeal and wounded pride, launched what he believed would be an unstoppable invasion, the Spanish Armada. For Elizabeth, this wasn't just a military threat. It was the ultimate challenge to her rule, her religion, and her survival. On paper, Spain's power seemed overwhelming. They commanded the largest navy in the world, flush with silver from the Americas and blessed, or so they thought, by divine favor. England, by contrast, looked weak. Fewer ships, limited resources, and a queen who still hadn't married or produced an heir. To many, it seemed inevitable that Elizabeth's reign would crumble beneath Spain's cannons. But Elizabeth knew that wars aren't won on paper. They are won with strategy, morale, and sometimes sheer audacity. And in 1588, she turned what should have been a death sentence for her kingdom into the defining triumph of her reign. As the Armada approached, Elizabeth didn't hide in her palace. She rode out to Tilbury, where her troops were gathered, and delivered one of the most iconic speeches in history. Dressed in a white gown with a silver breastplate gleaming over it, she looked like both queen and warrior, both divine and human. Then she spoke words that electrified her soldiers. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." This was more than rhetoric, it was transformation. She wasn't just Elizabeth the Queen, she was England itself, personified in a woman who refused to bow to the greatest empire of the age. Soldiers who might have doubted her before were now willing to fight and die for her. The speech was theater, yes, but it was also a moment of profound leadership. The battle itself was as much about weather and ingenuity as about bravery. English ships, smaller and faster than Spain's lumbering galleons, harassed the Armada relentlessly. Fire ships, old vessels set ablaze and sent drifting into the enemy's formation, scattered Spanish lines. Then came storms, brutal and unrelenting, which smashed the Armada against rocky coasts as they tried to retreat. What Philip II had called the Invincible Armada became a shattered fleet limping home in humiliation. Elizabeth didn't lead the ships herself, she wasn't reckless, but her presence, her speeches, and her framing of the victory made it clear the triumph belonged to her. She turned the Armada's defeat into propaganda, striking medals inscribed with the phrase "God blew," and they were scattered. In portraits, she was painted with her hand resting on a globe, pearls draped across her chest, and a calm, commanding gaze fixed on the horizon. These weren't just pictures, they were political statements. Elizabeth had faced the mightiest power on earth and emerged untouchable. But the victory of 1588 was more than military, it was psychological. Europe now had to take England seriously. Elizabeth, the unmarried queen who had been dismissed as illegitimate, had humbled the Catholic superpower. England's self-image shifted too. For the first time in generations, the country felt not like a fragile island under siege, but like a rising force, destined for greatness. This moment also reinforced the Virgin Queen's image. By standing in armor before her men, Elizabeth embodied both chastity and martial strength. She was not a wife or a mother, but a protector. Her very body, she declared, might be weak and feeble, but her spirit was indomitable. She had transformed her supposed vulnerability into the source of her greatest power. Still, let's not romanticize it too much. The victory didn't end Spain's threat overnight, nor did it erase England's financial struggles. But Elizabeth understood something vital. Perception often matters more than reality. The Armada became a story, a myth of divine providence and queenly strength, and Elizabeth made sure the story stuck. Part 8. A Crown Without an Heir. For all her brilliance in politics and triumph on the battlefield of perception, Elizabeth carried a shadow that grew heavier as the years passed. She had no heir. In the 16th century, this wasn't just a personal matter, it was a national crisis. Monarchs were expected to secure succession with children, ensuring stability and continuity. Elizabeth, however, refused to play that game. From the moment she took the throne, Parliament, ambassadors, and even her own counselors pressed her with the same question: who comes after you? And for 44 years, Elizabeth's answer was the same: silence, delay, or a carefully crafted evasion. She danced around the issue with speeches that mixed wit and defiance, once snapping at Parliament that they had no business asking about her successor unless they planned to kill her. Why did she refuse to name an heir? Partly, it was strategy. To declare a successor was to create a rival. In a world where assassination was a common tool of politics, why give ambitious nobles a focal point for rebellion? Elizabeth remembered too well her own imprisonment in the Tower, accused of plotting succession against her sister Mary. She would never give her enemies the satisfaction of having a clear alternative to her rule. But her refusal also reflected the gamble she had embraced as the Virgin Queen. By marrying herself to England, she had made her reign about the present, not the future. She didn't need to promise a dynasty. She promised stability now. And in an age when the future was uncertain, that was enough to keep her throne secure. Still, her silence created tension. Catholic Europe saw an opportunity. Many rallied around Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin, and a Catholic with a strong claim to the throne. Mary became a living alternative, a symbol for those who longed to see Catholicism restored in England. For years, plots and conspiracies brewed, tying Mary's name to rebellions and assassination attempts against Elizabeth. Elizabeth tolerated her cousin's presence for a time, even keeping her imprisoned in England under a kind of gilded captivity. But after one too many conspiracies, most famously the Babington Plot, Elizabeth's patience ended. In 1587, she signed Mary's death warrant. The execution was messy and brutal, but politically decisive. With Mary gone, Catholic hopes dimmed, though they didn't vanish entirely. After Mary's death, attention shifted northward to James VI of Scotland, Mary's son. Protestant, pragmatic, and ambitious, James quietly emerged as the likeliest successor. Elizabeth never formally acknowledged him during her reign, but she allowed the possibility to linger in whispers. It was another masterstroke of ambiguity. James was strong enough to keep foreign courts cautious, but never so strong that he threatened her directly. This balancing act lasted for decades, but it came at a cost. Elizabeth's refusal to secure the succession kept her enemies guessing, but it also kept her allies anxious. Her counselors often begged her to settle the matter, warning that the uncertainty would lead to chaos after her death. She ignored them, convinced that clarity would weaken her. In truth, Elizabeth's gamble worked, at least while she lived. England remained stable under her rule, free from the civil wars that might have erupted if rival heirs had been named too soon. Her reign was long, her power largely secure. But the price of that security was a future left unresolved, a nation forever wondering what would happen when Gloriana finally left the stage. For the people of her time, this uncertainty was maddening. For us, looking back, it adds to the enigma of her reign. Elizabeth's refusal to name an heir was reckless, brilliant, and deeply human. It reveals both her political genius and her personal fear of being overshadowed. To name a successor was to admit mortality, and Elizabeth, who had built her image on eternal youth and unyielding strength, was unwilling to do so. Instead, she clung to the present. She chose to rule as though she would never die, leaving the future to sort itself out. And in a way, it did. When she finally passed, James of Scotland took the crown with relatively little bloodshed, beginning the Stuart dynasty. But Elizabeth never gave him her blessing publicly. Her silence was her final act of control, a refusal to surrender the spotlight, even in her last days. In the end, Elizabeth's reign was not defined by heirs, dynasties, or bloodlines. It was defined by her alone. And that may have been her point all along. She wasn't just a link in a chain of monarchs. She was the chain itself, unbroken, unmatched, and unforgettable. Part 9. The Golden Age and its Shadows. When people talk about Elizabeth I, they often use the phrase, the Elizabethan Golden Age. It conjures images of Shakespeare's plays filling the Globe Theatre, sea captains returning with treasures, and England standing tall as a rising power. And yes, much of that is true. But as with all golden ages, the shine often hid shadows. Elizabeth's reign was not simply a story of triumph. It was also one of contradictions, sacrifices, and costs. Culturally, England flourished like never before. The theater exploded, giving us not only Shakespeare but also Marlowe, Spencer, and countless others. The stage became a mirror of society, where comedies, tragedies, and histories played out for audiences of every class. Elizabeth loved the theater, attending performances and even protecting it when moralists complained that plays corrupted the people. She understood its power, not just as entertainment, but as a tool of unity. When Londoners gathered to laugh, weep, and cheer at a play, they were also affirming their shared identity under her reign. The arts extended beyond the stage. Portraiture flourished, with Elizabeth carefully curating her image through paintings that showed her as timeless, regal, and untouched by age. Literature, poetry, and music blossomed, weaving a cultural fabric that would outlive the Queen herself. For many, it truly felt as though England had become the center of the world. Exploration also defined this era. Figures like Sir Francis Drake circled the globe, while Sir Walter Raleigh planted the seeds of colonies abroad. These ventures filled English coffers, expanded horizons, and challenged Spain's dominance. Elizabeth didn't always finance these expeditions directly. Many were private ventures, but she cleverly positioned herself to take credit when they succeeded, and to distance herself when they failed. But here's the shadow. Much of this exploration was piracy by another name. English sailors raided Spanish ships, stole silver, and trafficked in human lives. The birth of England's overseas empire was also the birth of exploitation, slavery, and violent conquest. Elizabeth may not have invented this system, but her reign accelerated it. At home, her government navigated deep religious fractures. The Elizabethan settlement created a middle way between Protestant and Catholic practices, stabilizing the country after decades of turmoil. But this compromise came at a cost. Catholics who remained loyal to the Pope were marginalized, sometimes persecuted. Puritans who demanded stricter reforms were suppressed. Elizabeth's tolerance had limits, and unity was often maintained through quiet coercion and sharp punishments. Economically, the country grew, but not evenly. The expansion of trade enriched merchants and nobles, but many commoners still lived on the edge of poverty. Famine struck in the 1590s, and while Elizabeth's government introduced poor laws to provide some relief, hardship was widespread. The Golden Age glittered brightest at the top, while the lower classes struggled in its shadows. Elizabeth herself embodied this duality. She was Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the radiant figure adored in poetry and portraits. But behind the myth was a woman, aging, lonely, and increasingly suspicious of those around her. Her temper was infamous, her vanity exaggerated by the heavy white makeup that covered her face. She demanded loyalty but rarely gave intimacy. Her court, dazzling though it appeared, was also filled with anxiety and fear. Even in foreign policy, triumph carried shadows. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was celebrated as divine providence. But the war with Spain dragged on for years afterward, draining resources. Ireland, too, was a constant source of rebellion, brutally suppressed under Elizabeth's orders. These campaigns were costly, bloody, and left scars that outlived her reign. And yet, for all the contradictions, Elizabeth managed to hold the center together. She kept England relatively stable, while much of Europe tore itself apart in religious wars. She turned a small, debt-ridden kingdom into a confident, culturally vibrant nation that saw itself as destined for greatness. The genius of Elizabeth was not that she created a perfect golden age. It was that she convinced her people they were living in one. Through image, performance, and careful control, she transformed hardship into myth. Plays, poems, and portraits reinforced her as the symbol of England's glory, and that symbol was powerful enough to endure the shadows. Her reign, then, was both a triumph and an illusion. A golden age for some, a struggle for others, and a legend for all. And perhaps that was Elizabeth's greatest magic. She didn't just rule a country, she ruled its imagination. Part 10. The Final Curtain of Gloriana. After more than 4 decades on the throne, Elizabeth I had become more than a queen. She was an institution, a living myth. But time, even for Gloriana, could not be denied. The woman who had dazzled ambassadors, outmaneuvered rivals, and inspired armies now entered her final act, and it was a performance both haunting and unforgettable. By the late 1590s, Elizabeth was in her 60s, an extraordinary age in a century when many considered 40 old. Her once vibrant red hair was now a collection of wigs, Her famed beauty was maintained with layers of white lead makeup that cracked her skin, even as it gave her a ghostly, immortal glow. Her teeth were gone, her temper sharp, and her health fragile. Yet she still commanded her court with the same iron grip, reminding everyone that while her body might weaken, her authority did not. Those around her, however, began to change. Many of her closest allies, Cecil, Walsingham, Dudley, were gone, replaced by younger men who lacked the same bond with her. She grew suspicious, isolated, and increasingly theatrical. Her gowns grew heavier, her jewels larger, her performances grander, as though she could fight age with sheer spectacle. She demanded that courtiers speak of her as if she had not aged a day since her coronation. Painters were forbidden from depicting her with wrinkles. She wasn't just fighting mortality, she was editing it. But beneath the grandeur, loneliness lingered.
Elizabeth had no husband, no children, and no heir she had named. She had built her reign on independence, but independence came at a cost. Nights at court grew quieter, conversations turned colder. She surrounded herself with symbols of her glory, pearls, portraits, poems. Yet the myth she had crafted now felt like armor that grew heavier each year.
Her temper, once quick and witty, became harsher. Courtiers dreaded her sharp words and sudden bursts of anger. Ambassadors learned to tread lightly, fearing that one misplaced phrase might send her into a storm. And yet, even at her most terrifying, she remained captivating. To serve Elizabeth was to live in fear and awe, never quite certain if her smile meant reward or ruin. Then came the final decline. In her last months, Elizabeth became almost spectral. She refused to lie down, convinced that if she went to bed, death would claim her. For days, she stood or sat in silence, draped in heavy robes, staring into the fire, speaking little. Her ladies-in-waiting wept, begging her to rest. Physicians pleaded, but Elizabeth, stubborn to the last, resisted. She had spent her life refusing to yield, to men, to marriage, to foreign kings. Why should she yield now to death? Eventually, exhaustion overcame even her will. She was carried to her bed at Richmond Palace, candles flickering, courtiers whispering, the great drama of her reign finally dimming. There was no grand farewell speech, no final decree. Elizabeth, who had spent her life performing power, left quietly, slipping into history as she had slipped through every danger before, on her own terms. In those final moments, however, she performed one last political act. When pressed to name her successor, she reportedly gestured toward James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots. It was subtle, almost reluctant, but it was enough. With that gesture, the Tudor dynasty ended, and the Stuart dynasty began. Elizabeth died in March 1603, after 44 years on the throne. England mourned as though it had lost not just a queen, but a mother, a myth, a shield against chaos. The people had feared her, loved her, and sometimes resented her, but they had never doubted her. She had been their constant in an age of upheaval. Her legacy was immense. She had taken a divided, impoverished kingdom and left it confident, culturally vibrant, and internationally respected. She had ruled as a woman in a man's world, refusing to bend, refusing to share power, and proving that monarchy could be shaped not by heirs or husbands, but by one indomitable will. And yet, her story is not one of perfection. She could be ruthless, manipulative, vain, and indecisive. She clung to power long after her youth had faded. She left her kingdom uncertain about its future. But those flaws are inseparable from her greatness. They were the gears that drove the myth of Gloriana, the Virgin Queen. Centuries later, her portraits still stare back at us, pearl-draped, ghostly, unyielding. Plays and poems still echo her reign. Historians still debate her choices, and ordinary people still remember her not just as a queen, but as the Queen. Because Elizabeth I was not merely a monarch of her time, she was a challenge to time itself. She rewrote the rules, defied expectations, and left behind a blueprint for power that still fascinates us today. And though death claimed her body, her myth never died. In the end, Elizabeth didn't just rule England, she became England.